An exclusive at the end of the day, and we have a clip.
Yeah,
let's look at it.
Feel like anything here, like spiritually?
Do I feel anything spiritually? That's a very good question. I'm going to have to get back to you on that.
Okay.
Things come to me later in the day. So I'll probably have a great spiritual feeling late afternoon, early evening.
Okay.
It's usually after I eat. So that's what's going to happen. But I definitely will. It's very powerful to be here. You cannot see these sights and not feel some sort of a spiritual buzz.
You're always making fun of the fact that you're Catholic.
Yes.
And,
Yeah. I'm so glad we don't have a section here. There's a Christian one, but you know that they're not letting the Irish Catholics in because we ruin everything.
Not getting the world's most liberal Jewish tour, and I want you to know that there's a whole Jewish world beyond these lovely people.
Okay.
And in honor of that, I would love to give you my kippah, which represents liberal Judaism.
Okay.
To wear it belongs.
Thank you very much. Well, we'll see about that. I'm taking in all views. I'm taking in all views. It's the best that I can. You know? Yeah.
All right. Great.
But I also have this. I have this really cool. I think this represents Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom.
You had so much fun, and in that clip is Susan Silverman, who's Sarah Silverman's sister, who is a friend of yours, and her husband's coming on tomorrow. But
that's right.
You've been giving him the kippah, and she's a rabbi.
That's right. Now, Sarah Silverman, obviously one of the best comedians in America, good friends with Conan. Susan showed up to say, hey, you know, I'm a liberal Jew, and this is a kippah, a yarmulke that we wear, and just to let Conan know that he was getting a tour only really by the Orthodox. And of course, there's a big fight going on about, you know, liberal Jews having a spot to pray at the Western Wall, Judaism's holiest site. A little of it went over Conan's head, but he was very gracious. You know,
it's hard to go over his head because he's so tall.
Oh my God! Oh my God!
Just the height difference is hilarious.
And I have to say, you know, I also asked him, you know, what do you love about Israelis? And he said, you know, they are so funny, so quick to improvise. You know, this is why they're some of the best comedians in the world. He's just having a blast. And, you know, he went to go meet the Prime Minister, and everyone's kind of having fun with it.
It's really amazing. I'm sure the special is going to be, you know, something to talk about. And he went to Bethlehem. I'm sure there's, like, some funny stuff going on there, too. Anyway, so congrats. I know you waited in the heat all day. And I know you're probably like, oh,